constitutional democracy. The Interim Constitution, Act 200 of 1993, which provides for an entrenched Bill of Rights, was drafted between May and November 1993 and was assented to on 27 January 1994. It commenced on 27 April 1994 and governed South Africa's first democratic non-racial elections. It was replaced by the final Constitution, Act 108 of 1996 on 4 February 1997. By May 1993, the country was in a state of transition and intense political conflict. The assassination of Mr. Chris Hani on 10 April 1993 sparked widespread and escalating violence and demonstrations across the country, causing a climate of increasing political instability and volatility, with the potential of the country descending into a spiral of chaos. There was growing resistance to the inevitable political change from right-wing groups, and there was a third force at work coordinating deadly attacks and fomenting so-called black-on-black violence, particularly involving supporters of the African National Congress, ANC, and the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP. By way of illustration, townships in the then Pretoria, Witwatersrand and Vereniging PWV area, such as Boya Patong and Tokoza, were sites of intense conflict and deadly violence, leaving scores of people dead and rendering the affected areas effectively ungovernable. Deadly clashes took place in Tokoza between ANC and IFP supporters on 22 May 1993, leading to at least 9 deaths and 69 injuries, the vast majority among the non-IFP group, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report. The incident reportedly resulted from a march by ANC supporters from the Tokoza Stadium to the Alberton police station to present a memorandum. The violence erupted when the marchers reached the Tokoza hospital compounds, housing mainly IFP supporters. Armed IFP supporters were present outside the hostel, and both sides engaged in shooting. Afterwards, both sides gave conflicting accounts of the incident. The ANC claimed police shot at marchers, while the IFP hostel dwellers stated that the police fired tear gas at them. I should add that both accounts are in keeping with the fact that some state actors instigated so-called black-on-black violence at the time. The purpose of those who were behind these incidents was to derail the negotiations to end apartheid rule. The country was on the proverbial knife edge. A coalition of 21 right-wing parties, the Afrikaner National Front, was founded in May 1993, signaling increased resistance to the political negotiations. This era was probably the bloodiest in the history of the liberation struggle. It was only steadfast, insightful, and committed political leadership that had managed to keep the country on the right course to a political settlement and transition to a constitutional democracy. The Highgate attack was undoubtedly a false flag operation. The perpetrators clearly intended to pass the incident off as a racially inspired armed attack on defenseless white citizens by the Azanian People's Liberation Army, APLA, the military wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, likely to fuel interracial conflict and undermine a political state settlement. That false impression has been debunked and rebutted in the present proceedings, as more fully appears from the summary of the evidence that accompanies this judgment as Annexure A. I should point out that the then commander of APLA, Mr. Letlapa Mpaslele, testified and effectively refuted the view that APLA was responsible for the attack, or that a telephone call a few days later to the Citizen newspaper by a Mr. Carl Zimbiri claiming responsibility for the attack on behalf of APLA was genuine. I will return to this issue later in the judgment. Ironically, the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize was shared by the South African political leaders, Mr. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, as it was stated, open quote, for their work for the peaceful termination of the apartheid regime and for laying the foundations for a new democratic South Africa. End of the quote. A brief overview of the incident. The incident occurred on a Saturday evening at a time when the hotel was busy. There were patrons in all the bars, namely the public or men's bar, the ladies' bar, and the open arms bar. The attack started around 22:05, reportedly in the public bar, when a gunman entered through the door armed with an automatic rifle, confirmed to have been an AK-47, and started firing indiscriminately at the patrons, spraying them with bullets. A hand grenade and a tear gas canister were also detonated in the bar. Another gunman entered the ladies' bar and fired at the patrons, also with an AK-47. One of the patrons, Mr. Edward Bayman Lombard, returned fire from the direction of the bar counter with a .38 Special Rossi revolver. Mr. Lombard testified that he is a reasonable shot and he is convinced that he struck the attacker on the body with a few rounds. He expressed the view that the attacker must have been wearing body armor because the bullets did not affect him. The attackers intended to cause maximum harm and loss of life. According to the relevant ballistics report, Exhibit N, 56 7.62 by 39 millimeter assault rifle caliber spent cartridges were recovered at the scene. 19 were fired from one rifle and 28 from a second rifle. 17 7.62 by 39 millimeter caliber discharged bullet points were recovered. 4 were fired from one rifle and 6 from the second. 1 bullet was recovered from the leg of a survivor, Mr. Carl Weber, who was shot in the ladies' bar. It came from the second rifle. 9.38 special spent cartridges, all fired from the same revolver, were recovered at the scene. 1 discharged .38/.357 caliber bullet point was also found in the door frame at the hotel entrance, which was fired from the position occupied by Mr. Lombard. Various bullet holes were found, 7 in the foyer, leading to the ladies and open arms bars, which were fired from the hotel entrance. 1 was fired through the wooden panel of the door of the open arms bar. 7 more resulted from shots fired inside the bar from the direction of the door. 3 holes towards the back of the bar were caused by gunfire from a direction consistent with the position of Mr. Lombard. 38 holes were found in the public bar, mostly through the bar counter, caused by gunfire from the direction of the bar door. A tear gas grenade was detonated inside the public bar. A hand grenade was lobbed over the counter and landed in the adjacent pool room, where it exploded and damaged the wall. The explosives expert called by the families, Mr. Charles Nodi, in his report Exhibit O, had regard to the used tear gas canister and the fly-off levers of the strike or igniting mechanisms of both devices that were found afterwards inside the bar. He identified the tear gas canister as a hand smoke stroke anti-riot grenade deployed to emit tear gas. These grenades were manufactured at the Swartklip Products factory in Mitchells Plain, Cape Town, and were primarily supplied to the police and the Defence Force, as well as the TBVC states, that's Transkei, Botswana, Venda, and Ciskei. He identified the type of hand grenade by means of the fly-off lever and the damage which resulted when it exploded, causing a typical crater associated with high explosive hand grenades. He concluded that it was an RPG-5 anti-personnel fragmentation grenade. These were manufactured either in China, the Soviet Union, or other Eastern Bloc countries, and were never procured by the South African Defence Force. Mr. Derek Whitfield, one of the patrons who was shot in the public bar, managed to crawl to the front parking area, where he later succumbed. 4 patrons were shot and killed in the ladies' bar, namely Mr. Douglas William Gates, Mr. Stanley Hacking, Mr. Dion Wayne Harris, and Mr. Dave Royce Michael Wheeler. In addition, as indicated, a total of 7 people were injured in the attack, as presently advised. Eyewitnesses testified that the attackers were wearing balaclavas. There was an indication that they had black cream on their faces, and one attacker was wearing police-issue boots. After the attack, the perpetrators nonchalantly left the scene. They were apparently in no hurry to get away, and seemingly had no fear of being arrested. 2 of them were seen by a witness, Ms. Broderick, who lived close to the hotel, as they were moving on Voortrekker Road, which runs past the hotel. One assailant had a rifle openly slung over his shoulder. Security forces and emergency services arrived at the hotel shortly after the incident and took control of the crime scene. The nature of the proceedings: an inquest is a judicial investigation into a death not due to natural causes, where no resultant criminal proceedings are instituted. Section 5 of the Act requires, in such a case, that the prosecuting authority submit the relevant documentation to the magistrate of the district where the incident occurred, who is in turn obliged to ensure that an inquest is held into the incident and that the documentation is provided to the judicial officer who is to hold the inquest. Section 6 authorizes the Minister of Justice to request the relevant judge president to designate a judge to hold an inquest at any place determined by the judge. I should add that this procedure was followed in the present matter, where I determined that the proceedings would be at the Special Investigating Tribunal premises in East London, mainly for the convenience of the victims, the next of kin of the deceased, and the other affected parties. At the commencement of the proceedings, I granted an order in terms of Section 6, capital A, that a joint inquest be held into the deaths of all 5 deceased. The matter then proceeded on that basis and was held in public. Attorneys and counsel represented some of the victims and affected families. The Director of Public Prosecutions were represented by a team of 6 counsel. The object of the Act is, open quote, in the interest of the public and for the administration of justice, to conduct an official investigation into and to obtain a finding by a judicial officer on whether or not the death of a person who has died from other than natural causes was caused by an act or omission which includes or amounts to an offense by anybody. Close quote. Section 16(2) of the Act requires the court to record findings as to the identity of the deceased, the cause or likely cause of death, the date of death, and whether the death was brought about by any act or omission prima facie involving or amounting to an offense on the part of any person. The courts have frequently commented on the purpose of an inquest. The appellate division stated in Tilley, the full citation is Murray, N.O. versus Tilley, T-I-L-E-Y, 1990, 2 S.A. 899A, and the quote comes from 901E to G, and I quote, "The function of an inquest is to determine the identity of the deceased person, the cause or likely cause of death, the date of death, and whether the death was brought about by any act or omission involving or amounting to an offense on the part of any person. The underlying purpose of an inquest is to promote public confidence and satisfaction, to reassure the public that all deaths from unnatural causes will receive proper attention and investigation so that, where necessary, appropriate measures can be taken to prevent similar occurrences, and so that persons responsible for such deaths may, as far as possible, be brought to justice. The court in Tilly, which I've just referred to, further referred with approval to the following dicta in Timol. The full citation is Timol, Timol, and another versus Magistrate, Johannesburg and another, 1972, 2 SA, 281T, and the quotes come from 287H to 288A and 292A to B, and I quote, "For the administration of justice to be complete and to instill confidence, it is necessary that, amongst other things, there should be an official investigation in every case where a person has died of unnatural causes, and the result of such investigation should be made known. Therefore, the Inquest Act provides that if there is reason to believe that a death has occurred, that such death was not due to natural causes, and that it was not followed by the institution of criminal proceedings, there shall be an inquest as to the circumstances of the death. The inquest must be so thorough that the public and the interested parties are satisfied that there has been a full and fair investigation into the circumstances of the death." End of the quote. In the Arth, the full citation is the Arth, DE''ATH, open bracket, substituted by Tilly, close bracket, versus Additional Magistrate Cape Town, 1988, 4 SA 769C, and the quote is at 775G, and I quote, "The predecessors of the Act show clearly that the purpose of all inquests is to investigate whether, when someone has died or is suspected of having died otherwise than of natural causes, his death has been the result of a criminal offense, and if so, who the offender is. An inquest is not aimed at providing anyone's guilt, but is most certainly aimed at ensuring that, if possible, where guilt exists, it will not remain hidden." The court in Paddy, the full citation is Paddy, P-A-D-I, and another, versus Botha, N-O, and another, 1996, 3 SA 732W, and the quote is at 740J to 741B. And I quote, "By statute, the inquest serves to ascertain the identity of the deceased, cause of death, date of death, and whether or not the death was brought about by any act or omission involving an offense on the part of any person. Where sufficient evidence is brought to light, the inquest yields to a criminal prosecution. An inquest's most important function is not the simple determination of facts, however. Public satisfaction is the raison d'etre to reassure the public that every possible step will be taken to prevent similar deaths in the future, preserve, where pertinent, the integrity of the state by refuting all allegations of official misconduct, malfeasance, or negligence, and where the state's and agencies or persons' culpability is substantiated, bringing forth criminal indictments, remedial measures, and policy changes necessary to quickly restore confidence in the central authority. The importance of properly investigating deaths is explained as follows in Van Heerden. Full quotation is Van Heerden and another versus Joubert, N.O. and another, 1994, 4 SA 793A at 795D, and I quote, "The state has an interest in the proper investigation of deaths due to other than natural causes. Even if nobody can be held responsible for a death in a particular case, it may still remain pertinent to determine the circumstances and cause of death in order that appropriate measures can be taken to prevent similar occurrences. As indicated, the Act obliges the judicial officer to make findings as to the identity of the deceased, the cause or likely cause of death, the date of death, and whether, prima facie, the death resulted from an offence committed by any person. Where it is not possible to make any one of such findings, this fact must be recorded by the judicial officer. The courts have adopted differing approaches to the standard of proof applicable to findings under Section 16.2 of the Act. Section 16.2d was amended by Act 45 of 1990, which introduced the term prima facie in relation to the cause of death under investigation. Pursuant to the amendment, the court is required to make a finding whether the death was caused by conduct which prima facie amounts to or involves an offence. Commenting on the previous version of Section 16.2d, that is, excluding the words prima facie, the court pointed out in Claassen, the full citation is Claassen versus Landros Bloemfontein, 1964-4 SA 40 at 11C, that the subsection does not indicate what standard of proof should be applied, that is before the amendment. The court thus accepted that in the absence of any other obvious standard, the judicial officer was required to decide on a balance of probabilities. The test envisioned by the legislator was accordingly unclear. The court in Webster, the citation is Inquest into the death of Dr. David Joseph Webster, unreported WLD judgment by Stegman J., dated 22 January 1993, which was referred to but not followed in Goriwe. That court dealt with the interpretation of the amended subsection and concluded that the test to be applied is the criminal standard, namely, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The court further held that the words prima facie were introduced in the subsection merely to show that inquest proceedings are not final and binding determinations immediately affecting the legal rights and obligations of the affected parties. The latter remains to be determined in subsequent civil or criminal proceedings. The court in Goniwe, the full citation is In Re, Goniwe and others, open bracket, Inquest, close bracket, 1994, 3 SA, 877 SE. That court differed from the decision in Webster that I've just referred to, indicating that when the amendment was introduced, it was already known that inquest proceedings are not finally determinative of any legal rights or obligations. No amendment was accordingly necessary to clarify this fact. The decision in Claassen shows that the test to be applied was not clear. This was the mischief that the amendment sought to address. It was not to clarify a well-established position. The court indicated at 879 E to F of the judgment, and I quote, "The section, as I read it, now provides that the presiding officer must record a finding in terms of section 16.2d if, in his opinion, the evidence establishes prima facie that an offence causing the death of the deceased has been committed by any person. This conclusion is, in my view, supported by the fact that section 16.1 of the Act specifically requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt for a positive finding that a death has occurred in a case where no body is found. When Section 16.2d was amended, the legislator, in my opinion, provided for a different standard of proof. End of the quote. The court continued to consider the exact meaning of the words prima facie in this context. It rejected the contention that the applicable test is that applied in a discharge application in a criminal trial or for absolution from the instance in a civil trial, and pointed out that it is problematic to apply a test applicable to adversarial proceedings in inquisitorial proceedings such as an inquest. The court went on to say at 879H to 880A of the judgment, and I quote, "In deciding whether a prima facie case has been established, some regard must, in my opinion, be had to the reliability and credibility of witnesses if they had given evidence at the inquest. The fact that evidence has been produced which, if accepted, would prove that some person has committed an offence which brought about the deceased's death would, in my opinion, not be sufficient to justify a positive finding if it is obvious to the officer presiding at the inquest that there is no prospect of such evidence being believed at a subsequent criminal trial." End of the quote. Insofar as the applicable standard of proof is concerned, the court stated, this is at 880B to C of the judgment, and I quote, "Bearing in mind that the object of an inquest is, in my opinion, that the test to be applied is not the beyond reasonable doubt test, but something less stringent. In my opinion, the test envisaged by the Inquest Act is whether the judicial officer holding the inquest is of the opinion that there is evidence available which may at a subsequent criminal trial be held to be credible and acceptable, and which, if accepted, could prove that the death of the deceased was brought about by any act or omission which involves or amounts to the commission of a criminal offence on the part of some person or persons." In the matter of Paddy, which I've already referred to, the court considered the above-mentioned conclusions in the matters of both Webster and Goniwe, which I've also referred to, concerning the standard of proof applicable to findings in terms of Section 16.2d of the Act. The court supported the reasons advanced in Goniwe for disagreeing with the conclusion in Webster that the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Reference is then made in the judgment to the unreported judgment of Levy J, delivered on the 23rd of June 1994 in the Namibia High Court in the inquest into the death of Advocate A.T.E.A. Lebowski that fully supports the rejection by the court in Goniwe of the beyond reasonable doubt standard in Webster, describing it as obviously incorrect. Levy J then commented as follows with regard to the application of the standard. The extract that I'll be referring to has been reproduced in, and I'm quoting it from Paddy at 793G to I, and I quote, "However, I respectfully do not agree with Zitzman JP when he says, in respect of the words prima facie, that, open quote, the test envisaged by the Inquest Act is whether the judicial officer is of the opinion that there is evidence available which may, at a subsequent criminal trial, be held to be credible and acceptable," close quote. Carrying on with the original quote, "For reasons I have already stated, there may be no criminal trial. The judicial officer is required on the evidence and documentation submitted to him to decide whether or not a witness is, open quote, credible and acceptable, close quote, and if he is not, his evidence must be rejected. If the judicial officer rejects that evidence, he may nevertheless be left with some remaining evidence prima facie involving a person or amounting to an offence by a person. If the person so incriminated gives evidence in the inquest court, which is acceptable to the judicial officer and which gainsays the remaining evidence, there is then no prima facie evidence involving or amounting to an offence. Should the evidence not be acceptable to the inquest officer, the remaining evidence may well prima facie involve a person or amount to an offence. End of the quote. The court in Paddy supported the approach of Levy J. that I've just referred to the application of the standard, which differs from that set out in Goniwe. The court indicated that the judicial officer holding the inquest is not required to determine the section 16(2)(d) findings with reference to the credibility and acceptability that the evidence at the inquest might enjoy in a criminal trial. An inquest would not necessarily result in a criminal prosecution. It is an independent, separate process of significant import. The findings must be based on the presiding officer's own impressions and insights and directed at the object of the inquest and fulfilling the task of the presiding officer. In this regard, presiding officers are not required to place themselves notionally in the shoes of the criminal court. I agree with the conclusion that the beyond reasonable doubt standard does not apply to inquests. I respectfully disagree with the application of the prima facie test set out in Goniwe and approach the present matter on the basis set out in Paddy and Lebowski, with which I concur. The credibility and acceptability of the evidence must be decided on the totality of the evidentiary material placed before the hearing. The critical question is whether, in the opinion of the presiding officer, the evidence, on the face of it, or at first sight, indicates that the death resulted from criminal conduct on the part of a person or persons. In my view, this exercise is best captured by the following description of a prima facie case set out in Mazibuko. The full citation is Mazibuko, Mazibuko versus Santam Insurance and another, 1982, 3 SA 125A, and the citation, the quote comes from 133E to F. And this approach in Mazibuko must be applied, of course, mutatis mutandis to the present proceedings. Carry on, namely whether, open quote, a court applying its mind reasonably could conclude on the evidence in the case that the injuries to the plaintiff were caused by the negligence of the insured driver. End of quote. That is applicable to the issue in Mazibuko. Applying the last mentioned approach to the present matter, the issue is whether the court could conclude, applying its mind reasonably to all the evidentiary material, that the deaths were caused by criminal conduct on the part of a person or persons. This is the approach that I will adopt to the matter. The evidence, extensive evidence was presented at the hearing, which lasted approximately 5 weeks, to promote a better understanding of the expensive account of the evidence that was contained in the summary annexed to this judgment. I will proceed to give an overview of the evidence under the following subheadings. A, the affected individuals. B, early interactions with the authorities and the Appler theory. C, the role of Dr. Edelman. D, investigation by Captain Darrell Els. E, intimidation and surveillance. F, encounters with informants and witnesses. G, systemic, investigative and institutional failures. H, the fingerprints debacle. I, ballistics and explosives failures. J, other investigative lapses. K, failure to hold a timely inquest. L, political interference. And M, narratives. I proceed then to give that overview of the evidence. A, the affected individuals. The evidence showed that the victims, survivors and affected relatives were deeply impacted by this senseless attack. The victims Firstly, Royce Michael Wheeler was a 46-year-old married man who was shot and killed. Derek John Whitfield was a 42-year-old married man and a respected businessman. During the shooting, he sustained a bullet wound to the chest and abdomen, which resulted in his death. 3. Stanley Hacking was a 65-year-old widowed father. He was a regular patron at the hotel. He sustained bullet wounds to the chest, which ruptured his heart and lungs, resulting in his death. 4. Dion Wayne Harris, the youngest victim, was a 26-year-old man with a bright future ahead. He was watching rugby on the day of the massacre. He sustained bullet wounds to his right and left lungs, which killed him. Dion would have celebrated his 27th birthday on 13 May, which is also the date that his sister, Lindeen Page, was due to give birth to his first niece. And then 5, Douglas William Gates, a well-known and loved figure in East London, was a 56-year-old male. He had a deep love for animals and worked at the SPCA. Douglas sustained a bullet wound to the abdominal wall, rupturing the blood vessels in his groin and the buttocks, which led to his death. The survivors described how their lives were not only devastated on the night of 1 May 1993, but in the decades that followed. The immediately aftermath of the Highgate massacre left survivors and victims' families not only dealing with catastrophic physical and psychological trauma, but also confronting the justice system, seeking justice for over 3 decades. Neville Belling was 20 years old at the time of the attack. He is a survivor of the Highgate massacre. He is permanently disabled as a result of being shot. Neville sustained multiple gunshot wounds to his left arm, leg, and back. Never worked again after the attack and endured more than 15 major surgeries, developing sepsis and suffering multiple instances of heart failure due to anesthesia. His life has been one of physical suffering and emotional trauma, compounded by the lack of justice. He testified in the inquest. Carl Andrew Weber was 37 years old at the time of the attack. He is another survivor who continues to live with emotional and physical scars. He was at the ladies' bar at the hotel when gunmen opened fire. He was shot, which resulted in his left arm being amputated below the elbow, rendering him partially disabled with only 40% functionality in his remaining right arm. This led to the loss of his job, home, car, and relationships. He also testified in these proceedings. Bureaucratic indifference was exemplified when Carl was initially denied a disability grant, with authorities arguing he still had one functional arm and both legs, receiving only 460 rand per month after legal intervention. Another survivor, William Freddie Bolling was 45 years old at the time. He went to the hotel with his brother Keith Bailing. They went to the public bar where they intended to play pool. He was shot in his lower back, which resulted in serious injuries. He has also been in and out of the hospital ever since the attack. He indicates that he has not gone a single day without pain since the Highgate massacre, and he says that he has never been able to return to work since. Megan Nadine Boucher was 22 years old at the time of the shooting. She was present with Carl, Doreen Rousseau, and Douglas. While sitting at the old ladies' bar, she was shot in her right leg, which resulted in serious mental and physical injuries. And Nkosinati Alfred Gonchi was a barman at the hotel and on duty on the night in question. He was 30 years old. And Nkosinati was sitting behind the bar counter when gunmen opened fire, which resulted in a gunshot wound to his right leg. Although he survived the attack, he has since passed away. Doreen Rousseau, another survivor, who has since passed away, was at the Highgate Hotel having a drink with a colleague when gunmen opened fire. She was 57 at the time of the shooting and sustained injuries as a result of being shot in the leg. Finally, Charles John Bowdington was 40 years old at the time and sustained serious injuries in the attack. Relatives, as indicated, Lundeen Page is the sister of Dion Wayne Harris. She was 25 years old and pregnant with her first child at the time of the attack, which resulted in the untimely death of her brother. She has fought to keep the story of her brother alive and to demand accountability. Her advocacy reflects the resilience of the families who have had to endure the burden of living without loved ones, losing their solace and support. Bernice Whitfield was left without money or food to support her 3 children after the death of her husband, Derek Whitfield, having not received any insurance payout. 10 months later, she lost her 20-year-old daughter, Chantal, in a hit-and-run incident that police never meaningfully pursued. Yvette Wheeler, the daughter of the late Royce Michael Wheeler, confirmed that her father was the sole breadwinner of their household when he was murdered and that their family lost their house after his death. Further, she could not afford to go to university as a result of the dire economic impact of losing her father had on their family. The prolonged delay in addressing the Highgate massacre has meant that some family members have since departed. Amongst those are the parents of Neville Belling Sr., who passed away on 8 June 2016, and Zilla Belling, the mother, who passed away on 24 November 2017. And the father of Lundeen Page and the late Dion Wayne Harris, Neville Henry Harris, died on 18 August 2022. Lundeen's mother, Cynthia Lynette Harris, passed away on 22 July 2023. They went to their graves without closure. B. Early interactions with the authorities and the Appler theory. Initially, survivors accepted the widespread media and police attribution of the Highgate massacre to the Azanian People's Liberation Army, Appler. Neville Belling testified that he believed this narrative until 2005, when, during a mediation with former Appler commander Letlapa Mpahlele, he was told that the attack did not match Appler's operational style and that a third force might have been involved. This revelation fundamentally altered the survivors' views of the Highgate massacre and catalyzed the formation of the Highgate United Group to seek a coherent investigation from the authorities. Carl Weber described in his testimony the profound psychological impact of learning that the accepted or dominant narrative might be false. He described how some of the survivors, when they felt insecure or threatened, received personal protection arranged by Mpahlele. Such support was not forthcoming from the South African Police Services, the SAPS. See the role of Dr. Edelman, Dr. Tessa or Teresa Edelman. Involvement marked a critical turning point in the survivors' and families' quest for justice. Her December 2006 memorandum to the National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA, formally requesting renewed investigation and regular quarterly updates, represented the first systematic attempt to re-engage official channels. Dr. Edelman helped to organize the first gathering of Highgate massacre survivors in September 2006 at the Kenaway Hotel in East London. This was their first meeting in 13 years, where an emotional reunion exposed deep anger and confusion among survivors, who had all along firmly believed that Appler was responsible. Dr. Edelman's support extended far beyond organizing meetings to encompass comprehensive advocacy and personal care for survivors over decades. Through the Spirals Trust, her initiative, she facilitated critical reconciliation processes, including the 2005 mediation between survivors and APLA Director of Operation in Pashlele. She provided extensive personal support to survivors like Neville Billing, facilitating his medical treatment, surgeries and accommodation during health crises, while highlighting his immense courage and resilience despite overwhelming physical and emotional trauma. Dr. Edelman also documented the severe neglect experienced by survivors, revealing that, contrary to assumptions about white victims having adequate financial or insurance stability, many lived in dire poverty, such as Francina Wheeler, the widow of Royce Michael Wheeler, who resided in a garage without running water as she received no insurance payout. Dr. Edelman's work involved coordinating multiple families and survivors, as is apparent from a 2006 memorandum, ensuring they remain collectively engaged with authorities and maintaining detailed records that would later prove crucial to this inquest. D. Investigation by Captain Darrell Els and betrayal of the survivors. In 2007, the survivors' desperation for answers led them to fund their own investigation, raising 5,000 rand to send SAPS Captain Darrell Els, who had been the investigating officer from 13 May 1994 to 5 December 1998, on an investigation mission to Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth and Cape Town. Els claimed to have discovered evidence linking the attack to militarily trained operatives of the Hammer Unit, who had used the training site near Addo Elephant Park, where structures mimicking the Highgate Hotel were allegedly used for training. However, after completing his mission and claiming he had identified the perpetrators in a telephone call with Neville Billing, Els abruptly stopped communicating, later claiming his laptop containing all evidence had been stolen, leaving the families further traumatized. Els's investigation introduced tantalizing but ultimately unverifiable leads, including claims about Wayne Grobler allegedly confessing to driving the getaway vehicle, and Peter John Woest Hall as giving the order, along with Major General C.P. van der Westhuizen, Andries Troewig, Captain F.P. Dupree, and Sergeant Major M.D. Horn as participants. This explosive confession was relayed to the court through Frans Swele Molokome, who supposedly also heard this evidence at Grobler's house in Cape Town. No formal statement was submitted by him at the time of allegedly hearing Grobler's confession. Grobler later denied ever meeting Els and having resided in Cape Town. E. Intimidation and surveillance. The survivors' pursuit of truth was accompanied by incidents suggesting active intimidation, including but not limited to the mysterious 1995 shooting at Neville Billing's home, where automatic gunfire narrowly missed his cousin, and police later claimed the recovered projectile was just a piece of metal. This demonstrated the dangers faced by those seeking answers. Lindeen Page also recalled what she suspected was phone tapping in 2010, when she and Neville noticed strange noises and echoes on their calls before a meeting at Highgate. According to Lindeen and Neville, when they attempted to report their concerns about phone tapping to the Cambridge police station, Colonel Stephen Durant refused to take a formal statement, citing fears for his own family and his own safety, advising them to slip their statement under his office door after hours. Significantly, neither in his statement nor his testimony did Durant deny that this happened. He simply claimed that he could not remember. In my view, the version of the survivors can safely be accepted over that of Durant. F. Encounters with informants and witnesses. The investigation conducted by the survivors and the victims' families attracted various accounts from informants which, for the most part, amounted to a wild goose chase. Lundin and Neville indicated that Frederick Doc Petzer, or Dirk, told them that his brother, Sergeant Zich Petzer, warned him that, open quote, "it is going down tonight," close quote. He claimed that his brother phoned him from a payphone inside the Highgate Hotel to say, open quote, "it has gone down, it has happened," close quote, minutes after the Highgate massacre had taken place. The present investigating officer, Captain Peterson, records that Petzer claimed that when he spoke with Lundin and Neville, he was intoxicated. Petzer himself denied saying this. Further uncertainty arose from a chance approach to the family by Edward Bayman Lombard, a former Rhodesian army soldier, at Morgan's Bay during a private ceremony to scatter the ashes of Dion Wayne Harris. According to Lundin, Lombard claimed that he had been with Dion during the Highgate massacre, had pushed him down when the shooting started, and returned fire at the attackers. The randomness of his sudden appearance at a private family event understandably raised the family's suspicions. Over time, other figures stepped forward with fragments of information and theories that tended to complicate rather than clarify. The families received an anonymous digital tip in 2012 from a source on Mixit, an online chat platform, who claimed to possess footage of the attack. All to no avail. Neville disclosed this tip to the police, who obtained the necessary Section 205 subpoena and executed a raid on the property where these tapes were allegedly held. Unfortunately, there was nothing related to the Highgate massacre on these tapes, and they were mostly just pornography. Carl Weber testified about a former intelligence operative, Alan Douglas Elsden, who reached out to him. Carl recounted that Elsden said he had served in the police's crime intelligence service since 1973 and later worked as a private investigator. However, Elsden later testified that he had actually been a member of the security branch. Elsden volunteered theories about planning, authorship, and targeting concerning the operation. In a subsequent call with Carl's attorney, Paige Winfield of Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, he identified two men, one deceased, as supposed suspects based on a source he called Henny, later identified as Hendrik Low, who refused to reveal what he knew when approached by Winfield. In messages introduced from Annexure B to Carl's affidavit, being screenshots of his conversations with Elsden, the latter dismissed suggestions that ballistic exhibits were posted to Cape Town as nonsense, insisted Highgate, not Orange Grove, was the intended target, and opined that the attack was, open quote, a bright idea from someone higher up, close quote, rehearsed in detail. Ronald Parker's evidence independently corroborates the pattern and tenor of Elsden's approach. Parker testified that Elsden contacted him via Facebook Messenger on 30 January 2025, soon after footage of the inquest inspection in Loco was posted on Facebook. Elsden demanded secrecy and expressly cautioned Parker not to inform Neville, Dr. Edelman, or the legal teams. Elsden asked Parker to send him reports on the daily inquest court proceedings and to confirm whether the Hammer unit had been mentioned. Elsden passed on articles and an e-book titled My Cryptic Life about the Hammer unit to Parker and claimed that the unit was dangerous and still active. G. systemic investigative and institutional failures. Retired Brigadier Clifford Marion, the private investigator for the families, set out a litany of investigative lapses and blunders. Marion testified that, open quote, certain shortcomings amount to gross negligence on the part of the responsible authorities, close quote. Notwithstanding the involvement of senior and experienced police officers in the investigation, he summarized multiple lapses, including the scene was not properly investigated. No effort was made to lift fingerprints from the spent cartridges and grenade levers. Elimination prints were not taken. Crucial evidence, such as the ballistic and fingerprint evidence, was lost. Important statements linking identity photo parades were not completed. The docket was dormant and seemingly missing for several years, resulting in virtually no investigations during a period of more than 11 years, from December 1998 to August 2010. In addition, there were unexplained and lengthy investigative delays, indicating that the investigations were conducted with little or no urgency. In particular, these included several key aspects that were not investigated. One, the alleged Citizen newspaper call on 3 May 1993 claiming that Apla was responsible for the attack was not traced. 2, the call allegedly made from the Highgate Hotel phone booth was not traced. 3, the alleged getaway vehicle with a number plate starting with the letters and number XB3 was not traced. 4, fingerprints were not lifted from the AK-47 cartridges or the fly-off levers of the grenades found on the crime scene. Marion indicated that suspects often leave trace prints on ammunition while loading it, and such prints could have been matched against the AFIS system introduced in 2000 to 2001 or the Home Affairs ABIS database. However, there is no evidence suggesting such items were tested for prints, and not a single officer on the scene confirms or states this happened. Captain Peterson's characterization of this failure as a serious blunder highlights the magnitude of this neglect, particularly when contrasted with the elaborate fingerprint elimination exercise that apparently followed the incident involving 64 individuals whose prints could not be matched against negligible or non-existent scene evidence. Several police officers who were involved in the crime scene investigation and subsequent tasks, such as photo ID parades, did not make statements, including Warrant Officer Venkili, Sergeant Rattes, Warrant Officer Roos, and Sergeant Els. Sergeant Bosse, who attended the crime scene from 1 May to 2 May 1993, who only submitted an affidavit some 31 years later on 3 February 2025. Sergeant Brunt, the explosives expert who attended the scene. Sergeant Wayne Xavier Rattes, who conducted photo identifications with various witnesses soon after the attack, testified that he normally would have compiled a statement documenting the identifications as per standard procedure. He could not recall whether he made a statement or not, but admitted that the omission was disturbing given the high-profile nature of a case involving 5 murders. Warrant Officer David Henry Roos also conducted photo identification parades in which positive identifications were apparently made. He did not depose to any statement in connection with his investigations. When Roos testified, he claimed to have no recollection of his investigative steps. The complete absence of any recollection by Roos of his involvement in the investigation exemplifies the chaotic and shockingly poor documented nature of the initial investigation. Dean George Venish was a constable or lance sergeant in the dog unit in 1993 and one of the first responders on the scene. He witnessed one of the injured patrons refer to the attackers as, open quote, those bloody whites, close quotes. No